Okay, so I feel like we have strayed from talking about the wild robot specifically. So, this is where a lot of the focus is roles and responsibility to nature. For humans and AI, we are looking at the wild robot to see if humans and AI have the same views on nature or should have the same view on nature. I mentioned earlier, are we the protectors of nature? Or, and I think to put it better, are we the engineers? So, are we going to protect all nature should be saved, let's save it and use our technology to do so? Or is it nature is a tool and we are going to use it to benefit humanity in the greatest way possible? And to understand that, we really need to look at, and I want you to consider this, is how does Roz feel about nature? Do you think that that changes? Does how Roz think of nature in the beginning change from at the end? Is she a protector or an engineer? Does she start off as one and change to the other? And what can we learn from her journey? Are we supposed to feel like Roz and maybe that we should change our views on protecting nature or being an engineer to nature? Does Roz make the same mistakes that we feel people would in trying to connect with nature? And as I mentioned, we also need to consider that as AI becomes more advanced, maybe even more human-like, what about AI? If AI sees nature differently, because we mentioned that earlier, they view it as a system to understand. Do you think that AI would also want to protect it? Are they going to have this sort of good motivation to do that? Or are they going to feel so disconnected from nature that for them it absolutely is a tool? And we should find, trees make oxygen to help us breathe. Wouldn't it be easier just to find another way to make oxygen and then use all the trees for the wood to help us build houses and to make paper? Think about if there is any sort of good way to destroy nature. It doesn't really feel like there can be, but then again, that's what I mean is that we're human. We have these feelings about it. Do you think AI would respond differently to that feeling? And like I said, try to use Roz as an example of how AI might do that. And it also use it as an example of how a person might. And think about whether if a human version of Roz would come to the same conclusions that the robot Roz came to about nature and their role in nature and the environment. Memory versus data analysis. I talked a little bit about this and how we think about nature. But I mentioned that humans, they have imperfect memories. They have memories, I say they, but we, right? We have memories that are imperfect, mostly because they're selective. I mentioned earlier that if something is more traumatic, something more dangerous, we're likely to remember more things accurately. And for the other stuff, our brain kind of fills in the gaps. We generally know what grass is. It's kind of a blurry image we have when we think about things. And the biggest problem with ours is that our memories fail to capture nature in its proper way. Remember, when we're looking at animals, they're moving creatures. In that sense, we call it dynamic, right? They don't sit still. Even a tree, I know when we look at it, it may not look like it's moving, but the tree is made of cells, and those cells are growing and splitting and dying and being born again. The leaves are moving and gathering sunlight. They're very active. And our brains, when we think about and we remember these things, they don't capture it in the same way that you would if you had, like, for example, taken a video of that tree, or taken a video of those animals. Because they would capture how the wind is moving. They would capture how it's slightly changing in the light. But when we think about it, we kind of think of it more in a series of pictures. We don't really get the movement of it. And that's one thing too, if you've seen AI art is really good at capturing sort of the movement of nature. As I said, the dynamic, continuous nature that is part of the real nature. And then, to drive the point home, AI, it's wanting data. It wants objective data. Remember, objective means data that doesn't have any sort of opinion based behind it. And because of it not having the influence of emotion or culture or any of the stuff that comes along with human memory, it is going to capture a much more accurate image, a much more accurate picture of the dynamic nature. It can, especially if we have tools available to the AI to be constantly registering the moisture in the air, the nitrogen in the soil, the movement going on in the trees created by the animals, it is going to be able to have a closer depiction of nature itself. And that's something to consider as you're doing your writing, is when we are thinking about nature. For humans, emotion is a part of it. The selective details are a part of it. That is the way that we experience it, and it's the way that we connect. But AI will have more data. AI will have more information. AI will have more videos and pictures available to it at every time. Like, it is able to remember, especially if you take a video, it'll have the exact image of what something looks like at this time, or this time, or this time. And so, which one do you think is the more accurate version of nature? The way that humans remember it, or the way that AI remembers it? And before we jump to, well, AI has more information, it can do that. Remember, the way that people connect with nature and the way that we see nature is all much more similar to each other. And so it might be the way that humans see nature might be more connected to humans, if that makes sense. It might be more connected to how we can feel or connect to nature. But, as I said, it has its limits. So when you're answering the questions down here below, which do you think is more accurate and why? I want you to also be thinking about which one is more real. Okay, so we've been thinking about this for a while. So let's review. Because, yeah, you're right. What does all this mean? Can we do it in a simpler way? Here's what we should look at. Humans and AI both recognize basic elements of nature. We both recognize the basics of nature. The living things, the relationships, and the landscape, right? The shape of nature. But we both get that information in different ways. And so we have these subjective experiences. Remember, if objective is the factual truth, subjective is more of like the opinion. So subjective experience means like my personal experiences or your personal experiences and memories of nature. But AI analyzes the objective, just the factual data, the facts, leading to very different interpretations. And it is often why when AI does art of nature itself, it appears different. I mentioned earlier that, especially in recent times, AI nature is in constant movement. Whereas with people, unless we're making like a movie or a film, we're painting a picture. It's very one image, and that image is usually filled with emotion. And that's okay because it's an experience that all people relate to. When you're out in nature, we feel things, we see things, we sense things. But they are different ways of seeing nature. And super importantly is when we ask the question, what is the real form of nature? Because again, we're looking at different forms. Forms mean like the shapes themselves, and not just the shape like physically, but when we're picturing the image from nature, like when we're picturing the animal from nature, let's say we're picturing a bird. The real form of it, is the real form something that is charged with emotion and with our senses and, I mentioned earlier, culture? Or is the real form just the facts, just the data? It has 2 wings, it has a head, it has hollow bones that it can fly. Like, is that all that it is? Both offer important views on how we can see nature. And that's why we need to look at both of them and need to ask a question of which one is sort of the more real form. Which one do we think is closer to how it is if I'm not observing it, if AI is not observing it? Then what form is really closer to how it exists when we're not looking at it? And the reason why we're even looking at this, because I know what you're asking, is what does it matter? The question matters because what is nature's real form helps us to answer the question, who am I? Because we are, at our core, we are animals. But we are also very different from animals. We have feelings that animals don't have. Okay, so we are animals, but we're also very different from animals. We have a wider range of emotions than what animals do. We have a self-awareness is what it's called. I understand me and that I am a part of something much greater in the universe, not just the world, but in the whole universe. And this is something that other animals don't have. They aren't aware of what they're doing. They're just instinct going over and over again. And that's something that the wild robot does an excellent job at looking at, is what is instinct and what is what are these thoughts that are not instinct? And that is something that really makes us human, is that we are able to fight our instincts. We're able to go against our instincts in certain situations. Whereas an animal, can only follow that. So when we're looking at what is nature, we are really looking at who are we and how are we connected to nature still. Because we've kind of moved beyond it to a point where, like I've said before, maybe we're the protectors of it. Maybe we are the engineers of it, destined to use it. And understanding that can really help us find maybe our own destinies in the world. What are we destined to do? And how can we save the environment or use the environment as technology becomes more and more advanced and starts to not combine with nature, but maybe even come into conflict with nature. As we see in the beginning of The Wild Robot, Roz isn't exactly welcomed in nature because she's different from it. The same way that a person isn't exactly welcomed in nature. If I were to be in a forest and there's a bear, it's probably not going to be like, we're both animals, let's be friends. So we need to look at how we see nature in order to also help ourselves see how, or rather who, we are. All right, so let's go to our last part of the review. The limits of human understanding. Again, we're limited by our experiences. If we have not read about something or heard about something or studied about something in nature, we have no way of visualizing it, no way of seeing it in our mind or interpreting it. And that can be difficult, it can be limiting. And as I've said before, our memories are selective. We only remember certain parts of things. And so because of that, it's kind of like an unfinished picture, an incomplete picture, which is emotional. And it says overlooking broader complexity. What I mean by that is our visions of it can be way more simple. Whereas AI, again, is able to see much bigger patterns and connections that are invisible to us. It can process data, like lots and lots of data, in a time that would take a person years, if not centuries, to understand. So we are going to be seeing more and more understanding of nature because of AI. And then lastly, these two perspectives are not fighting each other. And again, by perspectives, I mean these two ways of seeing things are not against each other. They're not, it's this or that, but we call it complementary. They both complement each other. They both help each other's understandings of it, because AI can never understand sort of the incomplete picture that we have of nature. And because of that, it only has the data. And we can use that data to further understand our understanding of nature, just as AI can use the way that we see nature as a way of understanding something that came from nature. As I mentioned, we, at our basic element, are animals, and we have an ability to look at nature as an idea, something that other animals cannot do. And so AI can learn from us a more human way of looking at nature. And so if we look at these two together, then maybe we can have a complete understanding of nature. They're kind of more like two pieces of a much larger puzzle. And we need both to have a complete picture. And by reading The Wild Robot and thinking about these things, how is a robot connected to nature? How is a human connected to nature? Because it seems like there's no connection whatsoever with a robot. Like I said, we know that we're animals, but a robot's made by people. But as we can see in The Wild Robot, that doesn't mean that it can't form a connection to nature. And we should look at understanding that connection as something that is very different from a human experience, but we can learn about our own connections that way. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Well, everyone, my time is up. I hope you enjoyed talking about this as much as I did, and I hope you look forward to finishing The Wild Robot and thinking about the things we've talked about today. So until next time, goodbye.